So we're sitting here tinkering with some baits. Jamie, there's been some trends in bass fishing the last couple of years. I'd say you get the big baits. You get the mag spoons, the big worms, the big crankbaits, and then a couple years will go by and it'll be the really small drop shot worms, the Damiki rigs, small jigs as well. And that's one of your favorite things. We saw in the Elite Series this year, Jamie Hartman top 12s, almost every other event, and a finesse jig was a big player for you.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're gonna go through your setup, maybe your preferences, maybe some colors, but also jig trailers. When we're in a different point of the year where you can rig it multiple ways and be just as effective.
Yes. Basically, your finesse jig is just a downsized jig. You know, it's got a shorter skirt on it, a little more finesse hook. I like a stouter finesse hook for sure, though. A lot of baits out there, especially the jigs, you know, when they say finesse hook or finesse jig, they actually have a finesse hook on it. Well, we spent time designing this bait right here. This is a Minima jig by Riot Baits, and this thing has an incredible hook on it. We nailed the head design. It's got a stand-up deal to it, and your hookup ratio is phenomenal on it. So we nailed it with this, and we get great selection of colors. But getting into that now, once you get, you know, you select your jig, it's getting the right trailer for the right situation, preferences, cold water, warm water. So, you know, there's a few different ways you can rig them. You can take your bait and just basically nose hook it. I mean, you just come through the plastic here, and it's just going to hang off the back. You know, it looks kind of goofy a lot of times. You got a lot of hook exposed, the bait's kind of swinging there, but man, they eat it. They just plain eat it because it's got a lot of action to it.
And that's one of those things, for you, is that a cold water situation where you can kind of, it just slows the fall? I mean, that has to be a different rate of fall than threading a bait on there. Is it going to speed it up or slow it down?
It does slow it down a little bit because you've got more dragging in the water and you've got the claws back there. But in a cold water situation, I will opt for not the flapping craw deal.
Okay.
I'll stay more of a standard, something like this, where it doesn't have as much action to it. And that's another point I'll bring up too, is, all right, we're shallow water, we're skipping docks or whatever. If you take this deal right here and you're gonna try to skip docks with it, you're gonna have a heck of a time. It's not gonna skip for you. As soon as it hits the water, it's gonna roll. Your bait, your plastic's gonna keep on catching. So you can take that, and now this is where you go ahead and you thread it on there. Start at the tip, nice and even, all the way down through, poke it out, and then take it and slide it up onto the shank of the hook where your keeper is. And now you've put it in there, you've compressed the bait. You know, you can make adjustments on the skirt by trimming the skirt if you want to. And now this bait will skip a mile. So, you know.
You just turned it in from a 4 to 4.5 inch bait as well,
yes,
to now it looks like it's a 2.5 inch profile, and all you did was just take the plastic off and re-put it on and change the whole way it sits.
Yeah, that's it right there. So this bait's gonna skip really good right here. And if you're, you know, you've got, I don't know, whatever selection you choose for a trailer, a flatter one is usually a good deal. So I'll take this right here and I'll snip it in the front and I'll take the apertures off of it. And once again, you know, you rig it through and it's more of a flatter bait. So now you've got a flat surface on the bottom of the jig, so when you fire it, it's really gonna skip all the way back up in there pretty good.
And some of those creature baits that don't have as big of claws on the bait,
yes,
allows it to glide. And is that
yes,
something, like you were saying about cold water, you like that because it's more of a slower, natural, you know, the bait fish are just as lethargic as the bass are.
Yes.
So you're gonna want that jig to just kind of glide or just kind of flutter. You don't want it to really like be swimming through the water column.
Well, yeah, it's not, when you get in a cold water situation, very, very rarely do you get those fish that are eating it on the drop anyways. So once it hits the bottom, that's what you're really looking at. The crawfish on the bottom, you know how lethargic they get when it gets cold. So I opt for something with not a lot of tail action to it, such as this. You can apply it, you know, by the rod tip, but it's there. When you drag it, it's kind of just barely moving through the rocks or over the wood or whatever it is. You know, I seem to get a lot more bites with it. Put a little bit more meat on the hook. You know, they're looking for a meal. not something they have to work really hard for. So you chunk up the jig a little bit with a bait like that, and it seems to work really well.
You talked about rod action. For people, everybody sees a jig and they think football jig, arky jig, finesse jig. There's so many different jigs, and some people like to fish them differently. Are you a dragger, or are you going to hop that, or are you going to, are you going to pull it straight towards you to the side, or just bounce it with your rod tip?
A jig like this is made to be, well, I cast a jig a lot, like a finesse jig. I cast it, I skip it, and it's just that little rod tip action, bringing it over the bottom. You don't really, I don't do the snapping deal where it's leaving the bottom pretty good and coming back down. You want to maintain that bottom contact a lot of times. This will crawl over wood real good, but when I'm in what I really want to stay on the bottom, I'm going to opt for that football jig. This is one of my go-tos. It has been for many, many years. Once again, this is another football head style from Riot Baits. This is actually my design. I worked on it for quite a while, gave it to him. I know it looks simple, but there is some tweaks to it that definitely make a big difference for hooking fish and keeping them on.
Well, and for people who can't maybe see this up close and personal, this looks like more of a finesse football head than you would another one, because the skirt's a lot lighter, it doesn't look as thick, and the weed guard is a lot softer. It looks like it's so.
Yes.
Is that something, when you're picking a football head jig like that, what kind of rod are you going to throw in the finesse jig? Something, they're lighter jigs. Are you going to just pick it up with your normal jig rod, or what do you like to downsize to?
No, definitely. With this jig here, you've got a thicker hook on it. You've got a weed guard. So I'm going to run with a 7-foot medium heavy or a 7.3 medium heavy, depending on how deep of water I'm fishing, or what kind of cover I'm in, if I got to get them right out of there or whatnot. So when I'm running this jig, it's a more of a stiffer setup. I'm going to run 15 and even 17-pound line. Call it a finesse jig, but it's just to get your bites. It ain't finesse for me. I'm gonna get into them pretty good, because this hook can handle it. So, and then when you go to a more of a finesse style, this is a little bit lighter hook. It's got the light weed guard. This is one of my baits where it's more let him load into it, and then I'm gonna come back and really bow that rod over. So that's the kind of hook, only because the hook is lighter. The hook is gonna hold. I mean, this owner hook is super, super strong. It's not gonna bend, it's not gonna break on you, but you don't wanna rip it out. The lighter the wire hook you get, the more apt you can rip it out of the fish's mouth. So it's more of that load onto them and then lean into them pretty good.
And it'll just peg their mouth instead of pulling and tearing the side of their mouth. It'll just kind of staple up in there and then stay stuck.
Yeah, and you just keep that pressure on him and he won't come off. Yep.
Medium heavy rod. For your finesse jigs, more accurate. It allows that rod to load up a little bit more, and that's what Jamie Hartman made a lot of checks on this year.